for markets now, and on Tuesday morning, I was joined by Derrell. Derrell is our livestock analyst from Oklahoma State University, and the beef processing sector continues its recovery since the COVID shutdown. Let's get a look at the timeline to how we got here.
Well, obviously through the month of April, we got worse and worse as COVID swept through these packing plants and affected the labor forces. We bottomed out right at the end of April, first couple of days of May, and then we've been in recovery mode since then. And we've actually made very dramatic recovery in terms of the beef packing plants and in general, I think, across most of the meat industries. We're back up. The estimated daily slaughter, the most recent number that I saw, actually showed us about 98% of a year ago. So we're back very close to full capacity.
What do you see as some of the biggest challenges that are still ahead for us?
Well, I think, you can look at it from two sides. From the consumer side, I think we're past the worst of it. So we did have the disruptions in supply. We had shortages that showed up in the grocery stores and, all of that stuff. And that's really past now. We shouldn't see any more problems with that unless we have some sort of major setback. The problem still exists on the live cattle side. The feedlot side, obviously, we created a significant backlog through this process of cattle that did not get harvested on in a timely way. And so we're going to spend some time here, probably much of the summer at least, working our way to back to a more current situation and getting caught up on those supplies.
What do you think the situation has revealed about beef pricing and supply and demand? Maybe things that we weren't completely aware of before.
Well, I think that's a good way to put it. I think we've learned a lot about how markets really work. Markets do what they do most of the time in a fairly subtle way, and I think we take it for granted a lot of times. We're able to take it for granted. And with the massive shocks like we've seen this time, I think we've learned a lot about, sort of how markets really work. Markets have dealt with these shocks. You can look at the disruptions and so on, but on the other hand, we've really handled it fairly well. Now, in the process of doing that, we've seen some things that I think some people really weren't expecting to see. We've had some reactions that maybe markets were not working. In fact, from my standpoint, I would say these markets are working exactly as we would expect them to. And you get some of the kinds of surprises that we've had in terms of, wholesale prices going up at the same time that fed cattle prices are going down. And that's exactly what happens in a margin type industry, a marketing margin situation, when the marketing margin in the middle between those two markets changes.
And Derrell, you've studied these markets, you've studied cattle for a long time. What are some things that you personally have learned over the past few months?
Well, I think we've all sort of gotten to see kind of under the hood here, again, of how these markets work. And we've also learned a lot about the fact that these markets are very complex. I sort of knew that, but every day you learn something new. And certainly these markets have revealed, when we get into the product side especially, that there's a vast array of products. We've learned a lot about the two sort of major components of our food industry in terms of the food service sector and the retail grocery sector. I don't think we really appreciated how specialized those were. They're incredibly efficient at what they do, but we've also learned that they're a little bit vulnerable when we have this kind of disruption. So we've learned a little bit about some of the rigidities that exist in these markets, and that's, I guess, some of the trade-off we have for the kind of very efficient, very streamlined supply chains that we utilize in this country.
And let's look at export numbers real quick before we wrap up. Wanted to get a check on those, and you just wrote an article breaking down the data on some of our major protein exports. Any highlights on that you'd like to share?
Well, overall, if you look at the month of April, beef exports were actually down slightly year over year. We're up for the year. The beef imports were fractionally lower than last year in April, but they are up slightly for the year. But as we go forward, we're really expecting, modest strength in the export side. It varies a little bit by country. But we're expecting the overall trade picture to be fairly positive. In a broader protein sense, China is such a major driver of these markets. We expected that coming into the year. And even though there have been lots of COVID impacts in the Chinese economy and in other economies around the world, we still think that will be a major driver. So our pork exports continue extremely strong. We're exporting some broiler meat to China now. And our beef exports to China, even though they're fairly small yet, they are only about 1% of our total exports, they are growing, and we expect to see some growth in those as we go forward.
And Derrell, will end it today with any final marketing or risk management advice. And you can never really predict for the unknown, but how do you try to ensure some type of profit in these uncertain times?
Well, obviously it's a big challenge. Nobody really anticipated coming into the year that we would experience the kinds of things we've had. So it's been very much a year where we're kind of on the defensive. I think certainly any sort of aggressive plans we had are kind of shelved right now. We're trying to find a way to get through this and maybe minimize the damages. In some cases, at least, is more the strategy at this point. But that said, as we go forward, we're starting to think a little bit past the immediate sort of public health concerns, not to say that they're over yet, but now we're starting to really kind of focus on the recovery mode. At some point, there will be some opportunities. So, producers need to be kind of on the defensive, try to figure out financially how to get through this and survive it, first of all, but then, try to position yourself where you can take advantage of some opportunities that are going to come eventually. It's not clear yet whether they will happen yet in 2020 or whether we're looking beyond 2020, but there certainly will be some brighter days ahead.